Welcome to Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is a show all about music, music production, and the music business. This is our special 5th anniversary episode. We're going to spend it in a tribute to the great engineer Geoff Emerick with his longtime friend and assistant, Bill Smith. So yeah, 5 years. Who would have thought? This is episode number 258, and we started 5 years ago. The podcast has grown in terms of our audience, and right now I think we're in the top 200 in iTunes. At least I was told that. I haven't checked it myself. And we have lots of great new guests coming up for you in the coming year. So thank you for everyone that's listened. Thank you for all your support. And now let's get on with some news. This is kind of cool, I think. Warner Brothers is signing an algorithm to a record deal. Yeah, it's a bundle of code by a startup company called Endel, and they use artificial intelligence to make personalized audio tracks that are aimed at boosting people's mood or productivity. Well, here's the thing that will blow your mind. They're signed for 20 albums, and they've already delivered 5. And these 5 are a collection of sleep soundscapes entitled Clear Night, Rainy Night, Cloudy Afternoon, Cloudy Night, and Foggy Morning. And supposedly you can find these on Apple Music or on Spotify. I wasn't able to find them, and maybe I wasn't looking for the right title or something, but I couldn't find them because I wanted to check it out for myself. Anyway, these are designed to reduce anxiety primarily. Now, Amazon is a big investor, and you can see why, because what the company's trying to do is keep track of your emotions during the day via Alexa and then design music for whatever that emotion might be. So you might be thinking, okay, how does this work? Who is the artist here? Yeah, it's a good question. And it actually perplexed a lot of people, especially the copyright attorneys. So what they wound up doing is putting the names of all the software engineers as writers who will collect royalties. I can't imagine there are going to be a ton of royalties from people listening to this, but nonetheless, it's a step in a new direction. I don't know if it's better or worse. Now, you might say, okay, this is probably taking work away from artists who are doing something very similar, and maybe that's true. But I think the category is small enough that probably no one will feel it one way or the other. So let's see where this leads. If this goes beyond emotional categories, then I think maybe songwriters ought to worry, but right now, don't lose too much sleep over it. If you have any questions or comments, send them to questions@BobbyOInnerCircle.com. Don't forget about my online courses on mixing, production, branding, and music business success at BobbyOwsinskiCourses.com. That's all one word, BobbyOwsinskiCourses.com. Also, get an expert analysis and objective opinion of your songs and mixes as a member of my Hitmakers Club. Go to hitmakersclub.com to learn more. Now, this is kind of interesting. A big counterfeit gear ring was just busted in Enpeg City in China. A company called Soundpu, sound with a PU at the end, was busted for manufacturing fake Shure, Sennheiser, Yamaha, and Harman gear. Now, we've been seeing clones like these for quite a long time, but the difference is these actually had the logos of Shure and Sennheiser and Yamaha and DBX. So what they were making were amplifiers, microphones, DBX processors, everything you can think of. Now, if you happen to go to their website, what you find is they have their own brand called Voxpu, VOXPU. And they make the exact same product. So if you look side by side, you find a Voxpu amplifier or a microphone or a processor, and then you look right next to it, and there's the DBX or the Sennheiser branded same product. It's tough enough to make things go in the world today in business, let alone having to deal with counterfeiters. So it's a good thing that this ring was busted, and let's hope it stays that way. Recently, I had a conversation with engineer Bill Smith about the late engineer Geoff Emerick, and I realized that there was a lot that we didn't know about the man. even though he is responsible for some huge hit records that shaped the lives and careers of so many people. Although he's most famous for recording the Beatles, Geoff recorded songs that we hear every day in the radio by the Zombies and Stealers Wheel and America, Supertramp, Jeff Beck, Kate Bush, Oasis, Cheap Trick, and so many more. Bill Smith was his assistant and best friend for many years and knows about as much about Geoff as anybody. So I asked him to come on the show and to give us some insight to this great man. In the interview, you'll hear some interesting facts about how Geoff mic'd Paul McCartney's bass, how he needed to get EMI's written permission to be able to experiment with some of his miking techniques, and those techniques are now standard in the way we do things in the studio, and how his bass and drum techniques have become so influential to today's recording, and so much more. I spoke with Bill via phone from his home in Los Angeles. Let's start with when you first met Geoff. When was that?
I first met Geoff, if my memory serves correctly, somewhere, I believe about 92, 91, somewhere in there. May have been a little earlier, actually. When I was working at Cherokee, he came in to do a session there. Couldn't tell you who it was for. Don't remember. Too long ago. But I was assigned to work with him, and it was the first time I met him, and we had a great time. You know, the two of us, we worked very well together. We got along very well, had same sensibilities about music, same type of a work ethic. We had a shared sense of humor, which helped make the sessions go a little easier, as things like that always does, if you can keep it lighthearted, and that sort of a thing. And we just got on very well as people. We had a lot in common, you know, as we came to discover across the years, you know, in terms of our background and our family history and things like that, a lot of similarities. And, yeah, and then from there, we just sort of moved forward. And he and I worked together several times at Capitol when I had moved over to Capitol in 93. And we just sort of became very great friends. I just, you know, began to ring him up all the time and phone him and, hi, how you doing? And let's go do this. Let's get lunch. And sort of just evolved a great friendship from there on out, you know, a true friendship, you know, not just one based on adoration or, you know, that kind of a thing. Although obviously, you know, his work preceded him and all of that stuff, but there was something beyond sort of the general, you know, oh, wow, all the things you've sort of done. You know, we developed a friendship that was more of a, you know, a guy type of friendship where we would talk about the music, we'd talk about gardening, sprinkler systems that need to get fixed. They got to dig up the roots to my tree. Do you want to go to Home Depot? That sort of thing. We became sort of intertwined in each other's lives, I suppose, over the years, which was great. And I really got to know him as a human being, you know, in addition to his fine work as an engineer, of course, and all the things he had accomplished across his career. So that was a great blessing and something I will always treasure, for sure.
Let's talk about you working with him for a second. What did you learn from watching him?
All kinds of things. Be fearless is one thing. Don't be afraid to take chances. Be fearless. Don't pay attention to the so-called rules or unwritten rules of what you can or can't do or what you should or shouldn't do as well. Just be absolutely fearless in your pursuit of trying to make things better. Be fearless in your pursuit of trying to make things different and new. And just because things don't look right or aren't the way you would typically see things set up doesn't mean they're wrong. In fact, if you give things a chance, that you'll actually be very pleasantly surprised. A lot of times, what you hear, don't pay attention to the meters, but then again, don't pay attention to the meters, right? If it's going in the red, that's okay. Don't look over there. You know, how does it sound coming out of the speakers? You know, Stop looking at the meters, right? You don't make music with your eyes. Don't look. Listen, right? Use your ears. How does it sound? If it sounds good, it sounds great. It is good, and it is great. Just from that, like that on the technical end of things, be happy to be there each day. Have a good, positive attitude, right? For your clients. Try to, you're there to serve them and help them realize their goals and their dreams. So be there for that reason. It's not about you each day, right? It's about them. Have a sense of humility about yourself at all times, no matter how far you go up the ladder of success, that you can very easily knock yourself off the top of that ladder if you get too big for your own britches and that sort of thing. So be thankful that you're there. Be humble. You have gratitude that you've been hired. And just do the best work that you can. You know, if you're asked a question, answer it truthfully, and just try to be a positive force in the room as best you can be as well. Just from that side of the whole record making process, which is, you know, a side I think a lot of people forget about. Geoff never forgot about that. He was always very in tune with, aside from the engineering expertise that I bring, am I bringing a positive attitude each day, right? Am I someone that people are looking forward to spending 12 hours in a room with each day? In those kind of close quarters and things like that. That's very important, but equally important, or in many ways almost more important than the technical end of things. You can be an amazing engineer, but if nobody can stand to sit next to you for 12 hours a day, you're not going to get that far in the long run. You know? So, just a tremendous amount of things for him.
I know you talked to him for endless hours on the phone, in person, and I'm sure you asked him a lot of questions. I'm also sure that you asked him a lot of questions about his career and about certain projects that he worked on. Did he ever tell you things that really surprised you or you learned from?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, things that weren't so surprising. Some things that I sort of expected in terms of answers. I guess the thing that came across to me as most surprising in all the things we would talk about is the fact that no one project was more important than the other, right? That every client was viewed and treated equally in his eyes, right? It could be from the Beatles all the way down to the albums to Elvis Costello, to to other bands he worked with, the Syrups, Nellie McKay, right? People who aren't quite, say, as famous out there in the world. Everybody was treated equally, with equal respect, and he approached each project with the same amount of enthusiasm and want to be there and positive vibes and all of that. So that those things, although after knowing him as a person, I wasn't surprised. At first, as I was getting to know him, it's a refreshing thing to hear, again, from someone who achieved the amount of success that he achieved in this industry. It's again reminds you just to be humble and more to the point, the reason why he was so successful in this industry, right? Which had, I think, far more to do with who he was as a person and how he was with the clients and things like that. The engineering ability was the icing on the cake. in many ways. But yeah, I mean, all kinds of things, from, how he would set up the live room with the musicians, set up orchestras, mic orchestras. He had some pretty radical concepts.
Give us an example.
Well, I mean, a fine example. I mean, there's many examples, but a lot of it, again, had to do with the fearlessness, close miking things, orchestras. Everybody wants to, normal thing is, put the violin mics, 10 feet away up in the air and things like that. He didn't bother with that. What was wrong with putting the violin microphone 2 feet away from the violins, right? What was wrong with taking the horns, the mics for French horns, and shoving them right up into the bell of the French horns? Why do they have to be, 5 foot back or more, and that sort of a thing? I think just radical in approach to what he was hearing in his head as well, and the fact that recording things like that, like it doesn't have to be the traditional way if you don't want it to sound traditionally, right? Mm-hmm. I want it tighter. I want the orchestra to sound tight and in your face, right? As he did. You listen to things, especially a lot of the orchestral stuff he did with the Beatles. There's hardly any room sound to it at all. It's very tight, very in your face. So he was very brave in doing that kind of stuff. His concepts for recording, the bass guitars, even McCartney's bass on a lot of things, just a small little amp head, B15 amp in the middle of the room with a ribbon mic, 8 feet back from it.
Wow.
In figure 8. So that you're catching the direct sound right off the amp, but you're also picking up a lot of the ambient in the room as well to add a bit of roundness and space around it, and that sort of thing. So, most everybody puts the microphones right up to the grill.
Yeah.
For these things. He, back them off. Let's get a sense of depth to the sound and a sense of space around it and air and that sort of a thing.
Usually don't think of a bass with having air around it, do you?
No. And again, if you look at a lot of these things, it's actually the exact opposite of traditional. Let's mic the bass from 8 feet back with a figure 8 microphone, and let's really get the sound of the bass where the waveform can develop, right? In terms of the low end. You're mm-hmm. back far enough where the low frequencies and the low end waveform can develop a lot and fully. Let's get a lot of air and space around that. But then let's take the mics on violins, violas, and cello and put them 2 feet away. Right?
Yeah.
And let's get those really tight and in your face and things like that, very different from what's normally, again, considered the way to do things.
Now, of course, he was the first, or considered to be the first, to close mic drums and take the head off the bass drum, but that was taboo in the days of EMI, and he had to get a special dispensation for that, didn't he?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. It was complete and total taboo. In fact, what he told me, and from some of the other people who worked at EMI at the time, Abbey Road, as it's known now, but back then it was just known as EMI Studios. He sent the technical and maintenance department into a tizzy by doing all that kind of stuff. And yes, he had to actually receive a written slip of permission to be able to move the mics closer than what the standard practice was at Abbey Road at the time, but contingent that he only did it on Beatles sessions. So once again, the Beatles being the exception to the normal everyday rule, right? Because they were obviously, selling the amounts of records they were selling and the popularity of them, and nobody was going to tell them no, they couldn't do anything. So yeah, he did that and more. And the thing too is if you listen to the records, right, you can really hear that change, right? The early records that Norman Smith recorded, and Norman did an amazing job. Norman was a fantastic recording engineer and went on to be a fabulous producer of early Pink Floyd records, and then an artist in his own right in England. Norman Hurricane Smith, who had several number one records as an artist. Norman's early records, they're very clean, they're very tidy, they sound amazing, they're pristine. You don't really hear the bass too much. You don't really hear the kick drum too much. There's not a lot of low end present or even lower mids. And if you listen to the last record Norman did with the band, which would be Rubber Soul, and listen to that and then immediately put on the next record, which is the first one Geoff did, which was Revolver, there's an enormous change in the sound between the two records. All of a sudden, the drums are up and in your face and loud and punching through, and the bass is really up there, and there's a lot more low end. You hear the kick drum really for the first time, right? With that sort of fullness to the music and the records that wasn't there as much on the early stuff. And again, nothing against Norman. Norman just approached things the traditional way, where, you know, I think part of the great thing about Geoff when he took over, and I think one of the reasons that George Martin wanted him in there, and even the guys in the band, was that he hadn't been there too long at that point. You know, he'd only been at the studio for about 4 years. Okay, so, and he had been around for a majority of the early sessions. That's the thing about Geoff, is that he was there the first night they ever came in for their original artist test tape session with Pete Best still on drums.
Wow. From
June of 62. Yeah, the second day he was working. Second day he got hired at EMI. 2 days hired on Monday, and Wednesday night he's standing there watching this unknown group called the Beatles load their equipment in for their original artist test tape with Pete Best, and then was Norman's assistant on a whole boatload of the early material, right? Those early records up to 66 when he took over. So Geoff was really there from A to Z for the majority of everything. And you hear, and the thing with Geoff, again, I think they wanted him because he wasn't a product of the system at that point. In other words, he hadn't been there for 12, 15 years. It wasn't, the rules weren't necessarily ingrained in him, right, where he wasn't going to break them and things like that. And he was young, as they were as well. I mean, he recorded Revolver when he was 19 years old. He was a kid, right?
Wow. And
youth tends to want to push boundaries and wants to say, well, why can't I do it this way? This is right, you know, where if you've been somewhere for a long time, you tend to sort of maybe lose a little bit of that. But so he had that adventuresome spirit about him. And the other thing, too, was I think when he took over in 66, was not only a big change in the recording of the music and how he approached the recording of the music, but also in the music itself. And I think it was a great alignment of the planets or stars, if you want to say, because that's him coming in 66 for Revolver was also the beginning of the band and Lennon and McCartney becoming far more adventurous in their songwriting as well, you know.
You just hit on something here that I don't think dawned on me until now. And that's it. He was really the father of modern recording, if you think about it, from the standpoint that the drums were important and the sound was up in front. The kick drum, finally, you can hear, and the bass as well, which most records before that, they weren't approached that way at all. And it just never dawned on me that that's the case. You think of Geoff as such an innovator, which he was, but that's one thing I don't think is attributed to him, and it probably should be.
I wouldn't argue on that, especially as it applies to records that were being made in the UK at the time, right? I think a lot of what Geoff was chasing, which he talked about many, many times, was a lot of the sound coming out of Motown.
Oh, yeah, right.
Here in the States at the time, okay, where they would get these Motown records, would come in the UK, and they would hear James Jamerson, and the bass is just huge and fat and round. And what are they doing in Motown that we're blowing it, right? Kind of how are they getting this much low end on the records and things like that? And I also think that applies to the guys in the band. I know McCartney especially. And that was one of the directives and one of the things, again, they were chasing, was the sound of records that they were hearing coming out of the States at that time. How do we get this sound on our records? How do we get this much low end? And how do we get the bass to punch and cut through? So, yeah, as it applies to things in the UK specifically, yeah, absolutely. Because I think the only other records that were really out at that time that were like that was, again, the stuff that was coming out of Motown at the time. Jamerson, or some of the things that some of the records Carol Kay played on and things like that. They were chasing. I think there was a constant sort of competition. They've done this. Oh, well, let's try to chase. Let's push ourselves to do something better, not only in the sound but also in the songwriting. As well. Lennon and McCartney being big fans of Brian Wilson and hearing things coming out like Pet Sounds, or right, and like going, wow, how do we top this, man? But absolutely, Geoff to me was always. And on all the subsequent stuff he did throughout the years, was kind of a master of the low end and the bass and things like that. The low end, the bass guitar was an integral part of his sound and a consistent part of his sound throughout the decades. Was the way he approached that.
You mentioned about how he recorded the bass, which in itself is really interesting. Was there an approach that he had to mixing in terms of the low end?
Yeah, well, get it up there and make it sound good, I think. And he did use DI. I mean, using direct inject and all that did come into play as well. So there's a lot of stuff, especially on the later albums and things like that, Abbey Road and stuff on Magical Mystery Tour, where it would be a DI at times, sometimes a combination of, right, a DI and the amp with the microphone and things like that. I think it was, the interesting thing to me that I think, again, a lot of people don't realize, I think his approach was, get the bass to sing, basically, right? And when they moved forward and got into records like Pepper, the thing a lot of people don't realize is that the bass guitar on pretty much everything on Pepper and a lot of the things on Magical Mystery Tour, and that the bass was actually put on last. It was the last thing to be recorded, which again is sort of the polar opposite of the way things normally are done. You get the drums and bass first, you get the foundation of the house, and then you add on top of the foundation, and you add the second story, third story, all the way up, and you put the roof on the house. And it's unusual to build the house and then stick the foundation underneath last, right? But as Geoff explained it to me, and he would talk about it in a way, even though it was a completely backwards approach, it was also a great way to do the bass, right? Because it allowed him to dial in the sound after the, right? So once everything was there, then he could sit and really dial in and tailor the sound of the bass to fit in there perfectly with everything else that was going on. This was also where McCartney's approach to how he played the bass and the bass lines in the Beatles songs, again, changed radically. This is, Geoff said that he and Paul would sit for hours and hours working on bass parts, where Paul now had the freedom to actually compose a bass part for the specific songs, and where his playing began to morph into this very melodic style of playing, these very melodic bass lines that would really fit around and in and under everything else that was going on, rather than just the standard, the sort of keeping the rhythm bass line kind of a thing, just you sort of hanging on the downbeats and stuff, where his playing got a lot more lyrical in that way. The other thing that I think about and thought about and talked to him quite a bit about is, again, the concept of doing the bass last, which, again, from a recording, mixing, and engineering standpoint, is completely backwards. But in the days of when all these records were done, was even more of a miraculous feat, because as you're filling up a 4-track and you're marrying instruments together on the 4 tracks, which would happen all the time because you only got 4 tracks, right? And you would take that 4-track and say, in the case of the Sgt. Pepper record, take that 4 tracks and then submix them down to mono or even 2 tracks to a stereo pair on a second 4-track machine, right? And open up 2 additional tracks for more overdubs, and there being no time code back then. So once you did your submix to the second 4-track machine, that was it. There was no going back at that point. So he had to mix all that stuff, imagining how the bass was going to fit in there, right? You sort of had to hear it in your head and balance things accordingly, even though it may sound crazy, right, as you're making that submix. But once you put the bass underneath, that everything, it would all fit perfectly. So that, to me, was always a tremendous feat of not only engineering and mixing, but also imagination on his part, to actually imagine, okay, if there's a bass here, let me imagine the space it's going to take up. So I've got to put the vocal at this level, or the guitars at this level, and the drums here, and so the whole process is a pretty spectacular feat of all of those things. Something that most people wouldn't be able to do today, or want to do today, that's for sure.
We've been talking about the Beatles for the most part, but I don't think people understand the breadth of Geoff's career and all the other great projects he's worked on. Can you give us an overview?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I mean, the Beatles were, 10, well, not even for him, 5-6 years out of a 50-year career, 50-year plus career. So, yeah, I mean, even though they're the most famous, it was actually a sliver in time. compared to some of the other stuff he's done. I mean, most people obviously know that he continued to work with Paul McCartney and worked on Paul for, countless numbers of records. Band on the Run, obviously, the most well-known one, but, Ram, Venus and Mars, London Town, Tug of War, Flaming Pie, but went on to do so many other things. The Zombies, the Odyssey and Oracle record, which is a fantastic record, which, Time of the Season is from the Odyssey and Oracle record. A great hit that everybody knows, Time of the Season from the Zombies. Actually, that record, the Odyssey and Oracle record, he did, I think, started work on that one like a week and a half after they finished up Sgt. Pepper.
Huh.
That was his next go-round. Yeah, was doing the Odyssey and Oracle record, which is a fantastic record. For those who haven't heard it, please, I encourage everyone to hear that. It's an amazing record. But Steelers Wheel, right? The self-titled Steelers Wheel record with Jerry Rafferty, Stuck in the Middle with You.
Yeah.
Is Geoff's work. Everybody knows that from just the radio play, obviously, a big hit song. And then anybody who's seen Reservoir Dogs, obviously, knows that song. But Robin Trower, of course, Robin's biggest record, Bridge of Sighs,
great record.
Which is a fantastic record. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see what else. America. Right, worked on 4 or 5 records with America, and a bunch of hit songs with those guys. Tin Man is Geoff's work. Tin Man is amazing, one of the biggest hits. Sister Golden Hair, Lonely People, for instance. Right, all these hit songs, great hit songs that most people know, unless you're 18, and hopefully if you are, you'll be finding them soon. But that work, let's see, Elvis Costello, his work with Elvis Costello, Imperial Bedroom that he produced, and all this Useless Beauty, which he produced for Elvis Costello, which are some of Elvis's, as far as I'm concerned, the best records.
Yeah.
There's beautiful records, and he really helped Elvis go from just sort of the angry rocker and helped take his music in a whole different direction. Gentle Giant, huge for people who are fans of prog rock and progressive rock. Gentle Giant, one of the best bands in that genre of music. Gentle Giant, Nick Hayward, Ringo Starr on the Vertical Man record, Cheap Trick, Ultravox, Gino Vanelli,
Supertramp.
Split Ends, Supertramp, he in the Quietest Moments record, Nazareth, Trevor Rabin, Nick Hayward, Big Country, those guys, Mahavishnu Orchestra. With McLaughlin, just great work with those guys. Badfinger, the Straight Up album, no matter what, their biggest hit, off the Straight Up album for Badfinger. A bunch of records with Art Garfunkel,
Jeff Beck,
Kate Bush, Jeff Beck, the Wired album, which he didn't record but he mixed.
Oh, okay.
And to me, that's just as good, though, because the mixes on that record are fantastic.
Yeah,
absolutely, just beautiful use of space and reverb and very atmospheric and just fantastic mixes and that sort of thing on that record. But yeah, it just sort of goes and goes and goes. There's such a quality of work between all of those acts across all the years.
Yeah.
And, it's a high quality consistency
right.
of work with all of it.
There's something I want to get to, and that there's some misconceptions out there about the things that he did or what he worked on. And there were some things that you wanted to straighten those misconceptions out. So what are those?
Well, I don't know if they're necessarily misconceptions per se, but I think a lot of times Geoff, especially as it relates to his work with the Beatles, tends to get overlooked for the things that he contributed to those records. I think the world sort of credits the Beatles and George Martin, right? But it was so much more than that. It wasn't, George Martin didn't record those records. George Martin didn't, no offense to Mr. Martin, obviously, right? But he didn't puzzle his way out of how am I going to get all of this on a 4-track tape machine, right? Or how am I going to make John Lennon sound like the Dalai Lama singing from the top of a mountain? Or how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? How am I going to meet their nonstop demand and push for new, different, new sounds, things sounding different. So I think, Geoff was as integral in the records he engineered for the Beatles, Revolver, Magical Mystery Tour, a bunch of the Wine album, Abbey Road, these things which are considered by most people to be the highlights of their career, these records. And I think he and his innovations, technically, his imagination of new and different ways to do things, close miking the drums, different ways to approach recording the orchestras, things like that. His use of ADT, right? The sort of the artificial or automatic, some people say it both ways, double tracking, the use of that in the mixes and things like that. I also think too, most people, especially in the States, most people have only really heard the stereo versions of all those Beatles records, certainly Revolver and Pepper and things like that. And they really deserve to hear and listen to the mono versions of those records, because the mono versions are really the definitive versions of those songs, and a lot of the singles that were released as well over time, Paperback Writer and Rain and things like that. Because the things you hear in the mono mixes that you don't get in the stereo mixes is just this aggression, this real sort of rock and roll aggression that doesn't really come through as much in the stereo mixes. The records and the singles and things like that were never meant to be heard in stereo, really. They were recorded and designed and built with only mono in mind back then. They were built with British, UK radio in mind, which was mono.
Yeah. And
so everything was really designed to be heard in mono. The mono mixes are where the band was present. Geoff, George Martin, and everybody worked together to get those mixes and things perfect. And when you listen to the mono version of Revolver and then listen to the stereo version, it's night and day, basically. The mono version is so far superior in balances, in tone, in aggression. The low end, the guitars are a lot more chugging and up front. You really get to hear the Beatles as a rock and roll band on those things, especially stuff like Paperback Writer as well. And Sgt. Pepper as well. Sgt. Pepper is a radically different record in mono than it is in stereo, and it's far superior in mono than it is in stereo.
I know Ken Scott told me that they would spend all of their time with the band. Everybody would be working on the mono mix, and then the band would leave for the stereo mix, and they would do it in a half hour or 45 minutes, and that would be it. They wouldn't spend any time at all on it if they did a separate stereo mix as well.
Well, they did the stereo mixes for all those things, and yes, they were done sort of after the fact. And 9 times out of 10, no, the guys in the band weren't present. They just left it to George Martin and Geoff to do. and just trusted them, obviously, to do it. Because, again, as far as anybody was really concerned, the mono was the thing, right? That was the record. And, no, I don't think they, they certainly wouldn't mix the stereo versions of these records in half an hour or 45 minutes. They certainly took their time and made them the best that they could possibly make them, given the limited amount of things they could really do in terms of making them stereo. Right? Which is why, a lot of people over the years have thought, well, some of the panning choices are a little strange, or why are the drums sort of more to one side than the other, and things like that. But it's really because many of the elements were married together on the 4 tracks. Right? So you couldn't break things apart and do a stereo mix as we can do today. When you've got, a tambourine, a rhythm guitar, and the lead vocal all married together on one track. Right? Or other things, you're pretty limited in what you can do in terms of spreading things out in a stereo field. And then even by doing that, your things may seem a little weird, but you're also upsetting the balances of the instruments, because, again, everything was designed to be blended and balanced and heard in mono. And as soon as you start moving things off to the side, all of that changes. So they certainly took their time. I don't think, Geoff or George Martin were going to let anything go out that they considered to be substandard. It may not have taken as long probably because the band wasn't there, as will happen a lot. When there's 4 other guys throwing in opinions, it can sometimes slow things down a little bit, as anybody who's made a record knows, so it may not have taken as much time, but they certainly took their time.
Bill, did Geoff have a preference for gear?
In terms of what?
Well,
microphones, consoles, outboard.
Yeah. Was there something that he had to have when he was working, or was he pretty much agnostic?
No, he liked what he liked. Preferred Neve consoles, Neve or API consoles. In the later years, especially. At the time with in the Beatles era, he loved the Red 51 desk, which was the desk used on 90% of all the Beatles stuff. He loved the sound of that console. Didn't really like the TG consoles as they came in, because they were transistorized and all that. He thought they sounded a little too hard for him. But, that would only be in the EMI facilities. Outside of the EMI facilities, he preferred Neve consoles, preferred the sound of them. Obviously designed with Rupert the 4 sort of famous Air consoles, the ones that were installed down at Air Montserrat and Oxford Circus as well, designed the EQ and all of that along with Rupert Neve. So, he was very heavily involved with Neve way back when, and just preferred their consoles, preferred API consoles, again, which are very similar to Neve in sound, very warm, thick sound. In terms of microphones, in many ways anything went, although, he did love 47s and 48s and U67s and, the large diaphragm, 2 mics, had a preference for all of those things, but he would try anything. Coles, right, was a big fan of the Coles ribbon mics, loved the Royer ribbon mics as well, and used those extensively, and but everything was kind of up for grabs in a certain way in the microphone world. Outboard wise, not that much. 1176s. You had a bunch of 1176s. He was a happy camper. Or old Altec compressors or Fairchilds. He was the master of the Fairchild, as far as I was concerned, and still am, right? I've never really seen anybody use a Fairchild as effectively as he could, although he didn't like the stereo Fairchilds. He was not a fan of the 670s, preferred the mono 650s, and would use those as a stereo. He would use the two monos across the stereo bus rather than the stereo one. He thought the fact that the stereo one, that both channels were sharing a common power supply, he didn't think it sounded the same as the two monos, right, with two separate PSUs, that the stereo unit was a little thinner sounding because of that. So he kind of rejected the stereo Fairchild, but loved the mono ones, and whatever good reverbs were lying around. Loved DNT 140 plates and that used tape delay extensively, and continued to use ADT as well. He and I figured out a way to do ADT in the digital world, to really do it the old-fashioned way, right? And do it in the digital world, because a lot of ADT is based on taking the original sound off the sync head of a 24-track machine, right, which would then go to an external 2-track with VSO on it and that sort of thing, which, in the modern era of workstations, there is no sync head anymore. So he and I figured out a way to make it work via copying tracks and advancing them time-wise, and the little tricks that we had to go through and stuff like that to get ADT to really work, which he was very happy when we figured out a way to do that kind of thing. But no, I mean, he was in a lot of ways, very minimalist in outboard gear and things like that. He liked what he liked, and he was used compression extremely effectively on his records, again, being the polar opposite in many ways of what you're traditionally taught, right? Don't compress things too much. Don't over-compress. Geoff would just hammer stuff, okay, with compression, right? And, the first time I saw it, it was, I made my eyes bulge out. Again, but it was a matter of, don't look at the meter, how does it sound? And it's sort of how he got everything to hit really hard and just be kind of like right in your face. But it didn't sound over-compressed or anything like that when he would put it in the mix, again, because he understood how to use the compressors, right? Fast attack versus slow attack, release times, compression ratios, right? And how to mix and match all of those things, right? So you could compress stuff fairly judiciously, and it didn't sound over. It sounded great, So again, that's a lot of the stuff that you really have to learn from somebody these days. You can't. All the young guys and gals out there these days, you can't learn that stuff from a YouTube video. Yeah, right. Right, and you can't learn it by yourself in your bedroom, working in Pro Tools with a plugin. Yeah. The plugins are radically different than what the hardware equivalents do. They just don't sound the same. They don't work the same, and neither the twain shall ever meet. Yeah. Can you? So that was. Yeah, eye-opening for me, that kind of thing.
Can you tell the story about the Neve console? I guess it was at Air Montserrat, the high frequencies?
Yeah, well, that was, Rupert used to talk about that, right? Where it was, again, when Geoff was designing the EQs for those specific consoles, right? With working with Rupert to lay out the EQ, the frequencies, and all that kind of stuff. Rupert had sent over a prototype, right, for Geoff to check out. And Geoff got back to him saying there was something wrong with the high end on there. It didn't sound right. Right? It was something was not quite right with the top end, and had Rupert sort of scratching his brain as to what is he hearing? Right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't hear it. Nobody else could hear it. Everybody thought Geoff was nuts. Right? And so anyway, I sent the thing back to Rupert, and I guess Rupert took it and put it up on the bench and began to go through all of his diagnostics on the thing, and did that. Yes, found something amiss, right? And I can't quite remember what it was, something in one of the capacitors or something like that, which was affecting the ultra high frequencies on the EQ, sort of up around 15, 20K in that area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was not, much to Rupert's surprise, it was not correct. And Rupert was shocked that Geoff was able to discern this just from listening when no one else could pick it up at all. And, after that, Rupert obviously was enamored with Geoff and thought he had the greatest set of ears out there in the business and in the world, that he could pick up these sort of this particular anomaly in a range where most humans shouldn't be able to hear.
Yeah.
And I talked to Geoff about it a lot, and Geoff said to me, it's not that I could hear it was deficient, but I could feel it.
Mm.
Right? Something when you just sort of sense and feel something just isn't quite right, and I think it says a lot about Geoff, because, Geoff couldn't have told you what was wrong with the EQ. He just knew something was wrong, right? Subjectively felt that it wasn't correct, right? Which is, again, for me, a lot of who and what Geoff Emerick was as an engineer and producer, right? He was not the most technically oriented person, couldn't tell you what a capacitor did or a resistor or how things were wired together, did not understand things from an electrical perspective or a design perspective or things like that, but knew inherently from an emotional and feeling aspect of things, right?
Yeah.
Which to me was one of his greatest assets. It was never, right? He didn't get bogged down in how does this work, right? But it was more about how do I get this to do what I want it to do?
Right.
I want it to sound this way. So again, his sort of, I don't want to say ignorance, but lack of knowledge into the inner workings of things, again, gave him, as far as he was concerned, a great freedom to just go, well, just turn the knob all the way to the right. Why can't I? Okay, yeah. Well, why can't you? I want it to sound like this, and so don't just start twisting things and turning things until you got it to, he wasn't, he was, to him it was more, I think, and my take on him was more sort of painting in a way. I don't want to say that he was creating art because that sounds a little pretentious, but it was more, more that though. It was more that, more from the creative, pushing the colors and pushing sound around a palette to get it how you want it to sound, like building something out of clay and molding it, right? Yeah. So that you've got a vision in your head of what you want it to be, and it's a matter of sort of just pushing and pulling and changing this and changing that. So his approach to everything was more from an artistic perspective than, say, a technical perspective, mm-hmm. which I think was a great thing and freed him up. Al Schmidt is the same exact way. right? Al Schmidt is, again, not the most technically minded, but it's more about how am I spreading the sound around this canvas? That, right? How does it feel? Does it touch me emotionally? Right? How do I bring out the best in the song from an emotional aspect? Right?
Yeah.
And that sort of a thing. They understood that people don't relate to circuit boards or capacitors or pieces of metal. People relate to emotion, however.
Yeah.
And people relate to how it touches them. How does this make me feel? And how do I create an atmosphere with these things I'm given? Geoff used to talk to me a lot about looking at the music. And I don't mean looking at a workstation screen. He couldn't turn Pro Tools on, right? He couldn't even start the thing up, let alone use it or even look at it. He didn't even want to see the Pro Tools screen ever. Hardly ever looked at the thing. Didn't even want to know it was there. But he would talk about looking at the music in terms of the colors, right? And bass drums and bass guitars being sort of blacks and browns, and keyboards and guitars being sort of blues and violets, right? And those sort of oranges and things like cymbals and, high-end percussion, and that being sort of the yellows and golds, right? And and so he would almost see the frequency spectrum of a song as he mixed it from low to high, again, almost as a painting. In ways, or the blues and do I have enough top end, the golds and the shimmer, and there's the sort of the low end. He saw things in a visual way as well, not just sort of in an oral way of listening to it. It was also visual to him quite a bit as well, which was a unique way of looking at it, because it is really that as well when you think about it, in terms of tonality and spectrum and what occupies what place and how does it all sort of blend together, right? And that.
The last question, Bill. We talked a lot about many things that I don't think a lot of people know about Geoff, but is there something that we didn't talk about in terms of what people don't know about him?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably so much. I mean, obviously so much that I know about him after, he and I being sort of best friends for almost 30 years. I mean, obviously, that's something you can't replace. Geoff was, I think a lot of people felt that they could never talk to him, which was a shame, right? He was one of the most humble men I've ever met on this earth for the things that he achieved and accomplished with his life. He had no ego whatsoever. He would never broadcast his achievements. He was incredibly humble about all of those things. I think that's a great lesson to learn from a human standpoint.
I have a good story about that. That's exactly right. So I had met Geoff several times, but more or less in passing. And we were at a convention somewhere, and I was walking down one side of the street, and Geoff was on the other. And I saw him, and I was actually afraid to approach him. And I thought, he won't recognize me, and he'll feel like he's being accosted. And Geoff went out of his way to come across the street to say hi to me. And I was so tickled because it's like, man, this guy knows I'm alive, and it was an example of Geoff being Geoff, where, just as you say, really humble guy and very approachable.
Extremely approachable. Saw himself no different than anyone else.
Yeah.
And would never, like I say, would never broadcast his achievements. The gentleman who lived across the street from him here in Los Angeles, his neighbor Kenton, lived across the street from Geoff for 25 years, had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with Geoff over the years, sort of out in front of their houses, weather, gardening, etc., news, all that kind of stuff. 25 years, his neighbor Ken had no idea what Geoff did for a living. Had no idea who he was. Not one time in 25 years did he ever mention, oh, by the way, I'm Geoff Emerick and I did all of this kind of stuff. So there you have it. 25 years he lived across from the guy and thought Geoff was a screenwriter for TV, which tickled me to no end, and was blown away to realize that, oh my God, I've been living across the street from the guy who did all of this amazing work, worked on music and records that not only turned the music industry on its ear, but turned the world on its ear and changed the world. And here I am, I just think he's just this nice, private, quiet guy who lived across the street from me. So he was incredibly humble. He had a great sense of humor. Okay, absolutely fantastic sense of humor, almost mischievous.
If you didn't know him, you'd never know that. He didn't come across that way. Yeah.
No, because out there in the world and all that, he was always very guarded. He was an incredibly private man, and he was always gracious and humble, spoke to everybody. And as your story illustrated, would go out of his way to say hello to people. And it's a shame people over the years thought that, he won't want to talk to somebody like me. And many people said that to me. And I would look at them and go, what are you, crazy? Just go say hi. It's just Geoff. He's not going to bite you. Okay? Just go over and say hello. Don't act all goofy and weird like you're acting now. Right? Going, oh my God, that's Geoff Emerick. Just go over and say hi. Tell him who you are. He'll sit there and talk your ear off. Once you get him going, you can't shut him up, and he'll talk to you about anything you want to talk about. He's a highly intelligent man. Music, you want to talk about art, airplanes, politics, whatever. He'll sit there and talk to you about it. And everybody who sort of heeded my advice and would go over would all, call me up the next day or whatever and say, Don, thank you so much for, pushing me to go over and say hi to him, because it meant so much to me. And I wish more people had done that. In the couple of months since his passing, there's been a lot of people who have said to me, that they regretted not doing that, and I wish that they had, because he was such a lovely person. And if you didn't know and spend a lot of time with him, that the humor would escape most people, but almost a mischievous sense of humor. And he and I would sit at his house watching Faulty Towers and laughing our butts off at John Cleese and all that kind of stuff. And he enjoyed life, Bobby. You know what I mean? And lived it to the fullest. And he didn't take himself all too seriously, right? Realized and had the grace and humility to realize that it was maybe in a way divine intervention, and that he was one spoke on a wheel that was in the right place at the right time. And I mean him, the Beatles, George Martin, right? Yeah. Where the world was at that time, right? And meeting something like the Beatles, that it was really an alignment of things, and realized that, and was humble enough to realize that, and never thought he was above or better than anybody else. He was open to anybody's ideas, constantly learning, constant fascination about how can you do things differently, right? Even, after all these years, even he and I would talk about stuff that I've done on records I would be working on. And, you know, he would say, well, what do you mean? What's this you've done? And what's this? And how did that? And so, you know, he would pick my brain for things as well. And many other people. He was fascinated, never stopped learning. And I think that's also such an important lesson for all of us out there, that even someone who achieved the pinnacle of success in our industry and in the engineering field, the guy who's recorded and worked on the most famous records of all time in the history of this earth, and probably will continue to be for a long time to come, never stopped learning, never lost that want to learn new things and learned new things from everywhere and realized that he could. And right, never got too big for his britches, that he didn't think, you know, oh, what can I learn from this person or that he was never lost that sort of wide-eyed fascination of you can, you could, and you should endeavor to constantly improve yourself, not only as a human being, but in your chosen profession. Yeah. Each and every day. And that is one of the things that will provide you with a career that lasts for decades. You know, that sense of constant improvement and respect for the clients, the artists, respect for the music, respect for the fact that you get to do something that you love and enjoy in a world full of, in a world where most people don't get that honor and privilege to do something that they love and make a living at it. He was a terrific person. He really was. All, you know, just well-rounded. And those are a lot of the things I miss the most. Having just good laugh with him, and you know, and he was just a regular person. You know, that's the thing most people don't they kind of forget. You know, he was just a regular guy. He had sprinkler problems at his house like everyone else does, or my drains have clogged up. What am I going to do? Or they got the tree roots have busted through my pipes, or I got to go to Home Depot and I've got termites and there's squirrels in my garage. And, you know, he was just, just the same as everyone else, you know, and he's a terrific man.
Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@BobbyOInnerCircle.com. To listen to the episodes of Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle, go to BobbyOwsinski.com and select the podcast tab, or go to BobbyOInnerCircle.com, or you can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Mixcloud, Google Play, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and now Radio Public. At BobbyOwsinski.com and BobbyOInnerCircle.com, you'll also find a sign-up form for my newsletter and for alerts for new podcasts. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.